brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
We are on our episode 43 of our podcast, and I decided to kind of veer off the true and trodden subjects of actual history and talk about things that some people view as absolute history and some people view with much skepticism. It's definitely a story that has influenced human civilization throughout time, starting probably as far back in time as, 5,000 years ago, and moving forward all the way to the modern monotheistic religions. There are people who religiously believe that it is true and are out there searching for the remains and the proof of the events and finding them in all kinds of interesting locations other than the locations where they should be looking. And if you take the story outside of the religious and the faith concept, I think it's also an interesting anthropological story as well. So we are going to be talking about the flood, the biblical, and also it's a story that is recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh we have spoken about. It is a story that, of course, is a part of all three monotheistic religions. And it is a story that is one way or another way reflected in most human cultures around the world. And that is the story of the Great Flood. And everywhere from Japan to ancient Greece, from Mesoamerica to Siberia, everywhere in the world, there's one way or another way of a story of a flood that only a few or maybe a single pair or family of people survived. So, and since we're talking about Caucasus, I wanted to introduce a very interesting theory that I came across. That is a theory that belongs not to me, but to a wonderful explorer, a gentleman who is interested in the connection between kind of the small joint surface between the sciences of geology and of mythology, studies of mythology and folklore, and also studies of ethology, as he calls it. But we will talk about that in just a little bit. What I want to do is I want to actually start this by doing a little reading. And this is actually a chapter from my book, which I will finish one of these days. And it's a book that's called Thunder, and it's actually about the flood. Yeah, I'm like 3 chapters away from finishing it. I don't know, for 8 years now. Anyway, so this is a scene. If there's points in time where it seems somewhat disjointed, well, that's because there's intermittent real-time, modern time events happening, and then the description of the flood in question. So this is towards the end of the book, and that's the scene from the flood vision that the main character Alex is having. The pyre had gone out. At the summit of a nearby hill, Azrael's silhouette stood out in stark contrast to the brightening skyline. Below, inert forms huddled between the houses, hushed children, ashen-faced women, and giants, whose dark-veined wings fluttered over their families. The water was rising. Samael paced back and forth, ankle-deep in mud. The sin is ours. Spare our sons and women. Lilith emerged from within a house, approached him, placed her narrow palm on his shoulder. Samael had stopped pacing, constrained by the water that had risen up to his knees. He glanced about, absorbing the sight, rain-soaked structures, the faith in his people's eyes, women holding the children above the water. The watcher turned his face up to the sky and lapped at the rainfall like a dog. Return me your severity, and yet I know no severity such as this. His hardened hands twitched. My God, I denounce my title. The rain fell and fell, a sword edge endlessly coming down. In their panic, the livestock broke out of the pen. Mud-drenched sheep floated between the huts. The few goats kept with the herd had climbed up onto the roofs of the houses. The villagers were following their example. A giant, up to his waist in water, was handing a boy to a woman kneeling at the edge of a roof. A spring not far from the lower village had swelled and burst. The car knocked the giant off his feet. The boy was left dangling in his mother's grip. From his vantage point, Azrael watched the giant struggling to stay afloat. The angel's entire body signaled indecision. The giant tried to lift himself out of the water, but his rudimentary wings were splashing. A goat was backing away from the water, his shaggy form outlined by the lightning. Azrael plummeted towards the giant, resolved at last. A tree carried by the current swept a woman off her feet. Her carcass floated away. A winged form sped after her, flying against the wind, his left arm holding an infant to his chest. The giant's head bounced in and out of the water, his bulky body useless against the flow. His mouth was open, gasping for air. The downpour continued. Samael stood on the roof of his home, his feet shoulder-wide apart. Water splashed against his ankles. Lilith was speaking to him, her frigid eyes contrasted with her animated face. She pointed up at the sky. Samael's wings remained spread and still. I shall not abandon my brood. She buried her face in his back and hung on to him. Azrael's fist punched the water surface where the giant had last appeared. He froze midair, then thrust his entire arm into the mud, wings thrashing. Mariana was trying to push her husband away with her right hand. Her small breast heaved with effort. Azazel, go! With her left hand, she too pointed up to the sky. Her dress clung to her body. Ignoring his wife's protest, Azazel scooped her up and wrapped his wings around her. I cannot carry you, my wings are wet. A gust of wind ruffled the matted gold of the watcher's hair. Meanwhile, water had come up to Samael's chest. He hadn't moved. Lilith wept. Azrael folded his wings and dove into the current. The water surface resisted him, bounced him back into the air. He tried again, this time slowly. The water held him. He landed and dropped down to his knees, attempting to see down into the mud. Alex's perspective suddenly shifted. He felt himself struggling for air, felt pebbles and branches hitting him as they floated by. The current splashed against his cheeks. The water blurred out all the sounds. The giant was gone. Azrael wandered back and forth across the waves. His footsteps were Latin, but he trod on water all the same. Anyway, that's just a little chapter, kind of my little vision of the flood, but of course it is not at all what is described in our sources. So I want to give the credit to the gentleman whose theory I'm going to be using for this. And he is a gentleman from the Caucasus, and his name is Il'ham Gadjimuratov. Again, that's Il'ham Gadjimuratov. And this is a theory that belongs to him entirely. I'm not claiming that this is the truth in its final instance. It's just an interesting theory that I think would be fun to explore. So, as we all know, a lot of, I'm going to be talking from the biblical perspective here, though I'm going to be also referencing Quran and some of the quotes that I'm going to be making. That is because the author of this theory is a Muslim. And of course, both are very revered and very important books in human history. But from our Christian biblical perspective, at least my Christian biblical perspective, it is oftentimes claimed that the flood was a worldwide event. And theologically, that is, of course, as plausible, but geologically, that is something that's never been proven. There has not been any sort of layer of mud, any sort of layer of fossil mass die-off that would indicate that such an event took place across the entire planet.
Basically, there's not enough water to cover the entire Earth.
Right. Maybe the very first time, the very first rain that had ever happened, perhaps in that situation. Yeah, but that was long before humans. Much before humans, the first time the rain came down. So the geology does not really prove it. At the same, if we back up from the flood a little bit and just look at the whole canvas of the biblical stories, there are a lot of mentions of events that seem to implicate potentially, as in possibility, volcanic activity. For example, if you think about how many times brimstone and fire is mentioned, how many times molten rocks are falling from the sky, how many times there are events that seem to be involving some sort of smoke, some sort of boiling water bubbling up from the ground. I mean, throughout the Bible, there's small hints, and throughout all of these texts, of course, the original Hebrew text, there's small hints that potentially could indicate a volcanic region. And if we take that into consideration, and we think about what we talked about the last couple of episodes, when we talked about the Hurrian peoples, and when we talked about the Urartu kingdom, and how much those peoples who came out of what is now known as the Armenian Plateau, came out of the Caucasian mountains, and how much they influenced the entire culture of the region that much later became the contributing substrate, the contributing cultural canvas again for what eventually again turned into the Hebrew and later, of course, the biblical and the Muslim-based stories. It is not entirely implausible to think that perhaps some of these stories, especially with the Epic of Gilgamesh in mind, and how much that influenced the Babylonian culture and how much that later influenced the Bible itself, it is not entirely implausible to think that some of these legends may have come from a region other than modern-day Palestine and so forth, where there's not a lot of volcanic activity going on. It seems that the events that are described in a lot of these stories at the time period when they were taking place, there was not a lot of volcanic activity in the region that they ascribed to. And so if we take it as a possibility that these legends were partially introduced from a culture that came from much more mountainous region, then we are potentially looking at a region that is in modern-day Turkey. So if we look at what region did these people come from, the Armenian Plateau, we remember that when we were talking about Urartu, one of the names that archaeologists gave to that kingdom was the Kingdom Van, because Urartu potentially may or may have not been more of a region, like more of a description of a region rather than a name of a particular country. But the Lake Van is something that exists in that region, of course, to this day. And so here's this region on a modern map. And let us look at some of these interesting items that are described in some of our biblical stories. Now, of course, the biblical archaeologists have been long since searching for the remains of the Ark on Mount Ararat. But what does Ararat really mean? Well, if you look at the way that Semitic languages and a lot of cuneiform transcribes their words, they usually use the consonants, they write them down, but they don't usually write down the vowels. So Urartu and Ararat, as we discussed in the, for example, Hurrian, and we discussed in the Urartu episode, episode 42, are not really that different from each other. It's pretty much the same word with different vowels inserted. And that is pretty much a consensus among modern historians and modern archaeologists, people who work with sources and translate these cuneiform tablets and so forth, that is probably the same word, and that it probably refers not to a specific mountain in question, but actually refers to the whole region. But basically, it refers to a region somewhere where the Urartu culture used to exist. So if we take that as our premise, and if we look at some of the, for example, Armenian legends, if we look at some of the Turkish language, for example, neither in Armenia nor in Turkish language originally Mount Ararat as we know it today, and let me find this out. That's the lake, oops, that's Lake Van, that's the close-up of the Lake Van. And it's a very high up in the mountains lake. And that's the same lake. And then if we look, by the way, that's the view of the beautiful lake. And that's where our mountain Ararat is. So that's quite a ways from the lake. And that's the modern day mountain. So in ancient Armenian, for example, Proto-Armenian languages, that mountain was known as Maziz. In some of the Proto-Turkish languages, it was known as Ahur. And there's other names for it, but nowhere until more modern Christian times was it ever referred to as Mount Ararat. By the way, there's some beautiful views of that gorgeous mountain here. So if that is not out, and that's where most explorers nowadays have been trying to find the remains of the Ark. But if that is not our location, then what our location could possibly be? Well, for example, it's so Lake Van is a young volcanic region, and volcanoes there were active up until pretty much, late Middle Ages. For example, right here, what we're looking at right here, and we'll talk about it in more details, that's a crater from a large volcano that turned later on into a lake. And there was quite a bit of other areas around this region that were volcanically active recently. So it's possible that this particular volcano, so this is the Nimrud volcano right here. We know that that's, all those words, Ararat, Nimrud, those are words that we do come across in various versions of the recording of the legend of the flood. And if we, for a second, take away the premise that the flood was a worldwide event, but we look at it as a potential localized event that potentially took place in one smaller region, which a lot of even biblical researchers do think that that is a possibility, then we could potentially guess that it could have maybe taken place somewhere around here. Why? Well, because this is a valley. This is a very large lake. By the way, it's a saltwater lake. And there are some archaeological remains at the bottom of this lake. Now, 2 years ago, when this publication first came out, they were still just barely beginning their work of excavating. But the fact that there's some remains of settlement there, that's definitely not even a question. So who was our Noah? Let's see if our Noah lived somewhere in this region. And what did he build? What was our ark like? I'm going to stop and let Chris jump in for a second.
Well, I saw actually an interesting thing from a guy who reads cuneiform, and he was thinking that the actual shape of the ark was like a coracle, like it was actually round. And they still build boats like that in the area. So he was thinking like the idea that it was like the pictures you see with a long thing is actually not correct. So that's interesting, because the Bible doesn't actually say, it gives us dimensions, but it doesn't say the shape of it.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And what does the Bible says? Well, besides the fact that Noah was, of course, a righteous man, the Bible says specifically what it was that he was built. So he was supposed to build. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Now we're going to go back to the cypress question. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 450 feet long. Now, of course, this is an English translation, so obviously the Lord was not speaking in feet at the time. And 45 feet high. Make a roof for it and finish the ark to within 18 inches of the top. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. So we're talking about a 3-story construction, right? I'm going to bring floodwaters to the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. And I'm just going to stop there. Now, of course, again, this is a very late translation. This is a generic translation, not any particular one. And it's been Anglo-Saxonified in a way, to where the measurements, of course, given in the ways that modern English-speaking readers can understand. But there's a fairly detailed description. I mean, we know that Noah built his ark from wood. We know that Noah used pitch to cover it, to make it waterproof. And we know that it was a 3-story structure. I mean, I think that most sources do agree upon that, correct, Chris?
In fact, the Noah story that's in the Bible comes from 2 different sources, and there's 2 different stories interwoven, like the J source and the P source. And in school, we actually separated them and looked at each story, which stands on its own, but there are some subtle differences, like the length of the time for the rain and things like that. So it's a bit of a mess, the story that we have.
But as far as it being a wood construction, as far as it's being waterproof by pitch, and as far as being 3-story,
oh yeah, the instructions are fairly clear. I've built a boat before. It's pretty much how you build a boat.
So this is what the idea is. What we're looking at a region where at that time construction was mostly taking place out of things like stone and things like mud brick, which are not particularly waterproof construction. Well, they don't float well, and mud brick particularly does not stand up to water very well. So if we were to suppose that this particular very detailed, very specific story maybe was based on some sort of an actual ancient event that actually took place. Let's just suppose that for a moment, because there's a lot of very specific measurements in there, which, by the way, the Old Testament has a lot of these very specific measurements. I find that very awesome. But if we look at that, and if we think that Noah was a real person, what and who could he be? Let's say he is a man. He's a man who was an innovator in his time and who built something that was not, like Chris was saying, that foreign to what people in the region were starting to build. And I'm going to do my little screen share again, but I skipped through these earlier. But we're looking at the construction, most likely was not a boat, as I showed in one of my pretty pictures, but was actually a floating house, right? So let me show my screen real quick. So this is our traditional description of the boat with the elephants floating in it and all that other lovely stuff. Of course, why? I mean, if we're talking about a region anywhere between Caucasus and Palestine, we doubt strongly. I mean, there may have been some remnants of wild elephants somewhere in that area at the time, but most likely not giraffes, to say the least. So it's not likely that the Lord instructed Noah to put giraffes in his boat. What we're most likely looking at is something Again, this is not at all from the region, but we're looking basically at a floating house, something that is either round or square, depending on the building, construction building. In this particular theory, it is supposed that the ark was actually a square building. It was a 3-story square building that kind of looked more something like this, except add-on stories to it. So in a way that's actually not that very different from some of the illustrations. The reason why I picked out some of the flood illustrations from an earlier, in the earlier moment that I showed you guys already, I'm going to go back to them. I mean, here it looks like a boat, but the structure, again, would look at the medieval and later pictures, but the idea that it was actually a floating house, most likely a house floating on a raft. And again, that's not that different from some of the platforms that we see, heck, anywhere from the Slavic cultures to Native Americans to cultures where you have a flat structure, and on top of that flat floating structure, you have a house, a dwelling that is on the river, whether for protection or anything else. So if people in the area living on that lake,
even the coracle theory would work with this.
Right. Either way, I mean, it could be round or square, it doesn't really matter. So what we have in some of the sources, if we look, for example, at the Quran, and if we look at, because Quran was using some of the different sources, some of the early sources that did not get included in the actual biblical description later on in the way that we have it today. If we look at those sources that we know that there was the levels were arranged a certain way. At the bottom, you had your animals. On the middle level, you had your peoples. And then at the very top level, you had your birds. Well, what do we have a description of here? Most likely, we have a description of a dwelling where you have your domesticated cattle type animals on the bottom. You have your domestic birds up on the top, and people live in the middle. It makes sense, right? And this man most likely was an innovator in the sense that he has moved to a new form of house building. He moved to new technology. And when threatened with the possibility of the flood, and again, the Lake One is very high up, and it has very large fluctuations of water levels throughout seasons, even right now. If he had some sort of a messenger come to him, or maybe memory from his past ancestors, that there was potential for floods in this region, then it's possible that he innovated and improved the technology that was already taking place with people living on the shallow end of the lake. Let me pull up the map again so I can show you guys what I'm talking about. And that he actually waterproofed his house, as is described in the Bible, as is described in other sources. And that by waterproofing the house and by building it not out of mud brick or anything else. So our Mount Ararat is over here somewhere way off the screen right now. It's nowhere within the picture, but the mountain that we're looking at, if we look at the Lake One, is there's a volcano right here that erupted. By the way, we have record that it erupted around 5,000 years ago, which is about beginning to middle of the Bronze Age, when people most likely started using hard metals, doing hard metal work, and potentially had access to the necessary tools and also the necessary connectors to build such a formidable structure. And with the eruption of this volcano, if the settlement was located anywhere, and I even have pictures of where it may have been located, because there's a specific island that is very popular in Turkish tourism industry. Oh, by the way, those are the pictures of the volcano, the crater of the volcano. That's the Nimrud volcano that we're proposing may have been the culprit for the eruption. As you can see, it's quite a formidable lake on top of it. And so here is a little island. And the name of the island is Akhdamar Island. And it is a very popular tourist attraction. It has an old Armenian monastery in it. And here is our potential culprit for the mount where Noah could have wound up with his lovely floating device. It is a mountain that you can clearly see across the lake. Let's see. So this is where our monastery would be. There's our little island, and there's the mountain we're looking at. It's not terribly far away to float. And so if the volcano erupts, the volcano in this picture would be somewhere over here, that general direction. If the volcano erupts, and you have again another view of the same mountain, and it is the Sufandagi mountain, another view of it. So this is our overall map. Again, our Ararat is completely off the screen. And here's our potential culprit volcano. This is our lake. This is where, again, this is just one of the many, many theories that exist out there. I just found this one to be an interesting one. So if this is where it erupted, what happens geologically when these eruptions happen, that there is a volcanic buildup, it's a volcanic dam that forms between the upper and the lower part of the lake. And when under the pressure water, the water levels build, they build, and eventually they break through the dam. And quite frequently, those areas do flood. They flood quickly. And as we know in the Bible, we're not talking about a slow and gradual flood. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Black Sea, for example, theory. But that particular scenario and a lot of other scenarios proposed are not very likely to produce a very fast and very violent event like the one that's described in the Bible and is described in some of the older sources. Because, for example, some of the older Hebrew sources, they not only talking about the rain coming down, they're talking about springs opening up. They're also mentioning such things as boiling water, really hot water, something like geysers coming up, which again is characteristic of a volcanic region and not so much of a region that is no longer seismically active. There's some mention of tremors, and there's also mention of long, persistent, ongoing rain, which we know can happen locally as a result of a volcanic explosion or intense volcanic eruption.
I just had a quick question for Chris. Where does cubics come from? The measurement?
It's from the end of your elbow to the tips of your fingers. It's just like it's for me.
Like
it's 1.5
in
feet.
English, and basically, was there any standardization of that?
There was no standardization of measurements until maybe a couple hundred years ago at best, and barely. Like a foot was the king's foot, like a yard was, the nose to his end of his thumb, and different
Right.
king means a different measurement. So a cubit, it's a rough measurement.
Here to here.
I mean, that's good enough for building stuff. Yeah, I measured my own cubit just because I was curious. And when I was a kid at the time, it was 18 inches. I think it's a bit more now, but so I call a cubit 1.5 feet just to make life easy.
Well, and I was going to say, as far as the standardization goes, I mean, even in ancient Greece, I mean, an Athenian foot was nowhere near the same as, let's say, a Spartan foot. And they actually had a lot of problems with measurements for construction purposes and converting various necessary project information from one measuring system to another.
Even today, like a U.S. gallon is different than a Canadian gallon. That's just an example.
Yeah.
That I did not know. That's interesting. I mean, and and the standardization of the measuring system is something that humanity seems to resist with all its mighty force. I mean, look, even today we live in a country which uses feet and inches and.
Like in the movie when the Hobbit says it comes in pints. In Canada, a pint is 20 ounces. In the States, it's 16. So a Canadian pint will get you drunker faster.
Well, now we know where to go if we want to get ourselves to that. If we look at the idea that Noah was a real person who, let's say, and we're using this particular scenario, this particular location is just one of the possible locations. This, of course, could have happened anywhere in the world. It could have, anywhere that this tradition even existed in. And but the general principle remains that it potentially was a person who came up with an innovative way of constructing a flood-resistant dwelling that was very similar to a normal dwelling around the region, with the normal housing for normal domesticated animals and normal domesticated, bird and fowl. And that most likely who would have been in that dwelling? First of all, of course, him and his family, which is what we clearly get in all the sources. And also his precious, barely domesticated at that time period. Not terribly large, because we remember even our cows were kind of cute, small, and shaggy at the time, at least in some regions. Basically, you had your domestic animals that are precious to you because domestication is just something that was fairly new at that time, and you had your domesticated birds. Now, in that region, as far as the little part of the story where a bird is sent out of the flotation device, we're going to call it that, to try to find land, makes a lot better sense in that region, again, or any other region, because the practice of using pigeons for communication, especially between mountainous villages in a region that is cut by valleys and peaks, was actually common practice even back then. So after a local flight subsided, the fact that our hypothetical Noah may have tried to reach out to his next of kin around the area to see who has survived, that does not seem that very unlikely. So if we take away the grand and the universal application of the story, what we're looking at is a very simple anthropological story where a man who was really good at constructing a house has saved himself and his family and his immediate cattle and his immediate other sources of meat production. lived through a local flooding event and then reached out to see if there was people around that he could proceed to interact with. Now, there's a couple interesting things. The reason why this particular, rather quite simple story, like I said, that could happen anywhere around the world, but this particular gentleman was tied to that particular region is because, first of all, in a lot of even North Caucasian and some of the South Caucasian epic stories, their folk stories, their mythology, there is an epic hero known as Nahi or Nahi, who is considered by those people to be, even before the Christian and modern day Muslim times, before those world religions were introduced to the area, he was an epic character, kind of an epic hero that was considered by a lot of these peoples to be the originator of their tribes, of their family groups, of their clans, of their communities, of their ethnicities. It's a very prevalent concept in that region. Again, it predates both Christianity and the introduction of Islam to that area. Another thing is we know that some of the other potential concepts, such as the concepts of Eve, for example, potentially came from that region, was the Hurrian spread out in migration. We also know, and this is another theory, that when we talk about the location of paradise, and again, that's a widely debated biblical subject, where was paradise located? And there are a lot of theories. But there's some indication that prior to this geological event, and I'm not a geologist, I'm going, of course, of other people's research, that Lake Van was connected by some of its runoff, by one of its runoff rivers with the rivers Euphrates and Tigris. And that after one of the eruptions, one of the major tectonic events, that particular connection got blocked off. But if we look at the detailed description of the paradise, again in the Bible and early Hebrew sources, we hear about a single river that's served as a source for the 4 major rivers listed in the description of the paradise location in the Bible. And then another really interesting thing, so as far as the support, of course, in the Christian tradition, the flood was a one-time worldwide and enormous event. But if we look at the Quran, for example, it is quite clearly stated there that that was not the case. For example, and I'm quoting here, I'm not an expert on Quran by any means, but I'm quoting people who are very much in that tradition. So there are many mentions of a specific agreement between the Lord and the fact that punishment never came without a warning first. That's kind of hinted at in the Bible as well, but specifically in reference to the flood in Quran, it is not just hinted at, it is very clearly indicated. So for example, so in Quran 15-17 surah, it talks about events, multiple flood events, to where various individuals in various communities have had messengers sent to them, like a messenger was sent to Noah prior to the punishment that befell them. Another interesting thing about that island is that that mountain, that's the exact same mountain, some of the other languages now today, as I have mentioned, today it is in Russian, it is called Chetyr Dag. There's a couple Chetyr Dags. There's one in Crimea as well. But in English, it is called Sufan Dag. But that same mountain is also known as the mountain Athos, or I guess it would be Athos in English. And that is the mountain that is mentioned in the Greek mythology when you look at the ancient Greek flood story, where the last of the good people survived, as according to ancient Greek flood story. And that's just an interesting intermingling of potential locations that, again, maybe supposition, maybe guess, but it's interesting that that particular name had been in the past applied to. So this mountain right here, that's the beautiful mountain. Again, I'll go back to some of the pictures that we see across the lake, but that is some of the reasons why the author of this theory, who had deeply studied this region, who himself is from the vicinity of this region, believes that it is possible that this may have been the original location. Now, again, the Ark has been searched for all across the world. It has been found on Ararat a couple of years ago in Chechen Republic, in Chechnya. There was a sensational find of the Ark, but the chances of a construction, whatever it looked like, surviving for that long, and in this particular I mean, even in a beautiful, beautiful land like this, with great preservation abilities, just because it's so high up in the mountain.
Wood just doesn't last for 10,000 years or 5,000 years. It just doesn't.
Right. No, it doesn't. Though, what is interesting? There are some mentions, even as late. I'm going through some of these. Again, here's our volcanic caldera right here. Here's our potential culprit mountain, where we may think, again, if you ask people from Armenia, they're going to say one thing. You ask people from Chechnya, they're going to say another thing. Dagestani people will say another thing yet. This is, by the way, the Armenian really old monastery that's on that island. And it is definitely in Armenia, for example, there's a couple, Nakhchivali, for example, is believed Nakhchi, that word Noah is by some people believed to be connected. Again, that's the view of the volcanic caldera. It is a very impressive site and a quite tourist attraction today in Turkey. And of course, I talk about Turkey and I talk about Armenia. This territory back, of course, before modern times was part of the larger Armenian, not Turkish, Armenian territory. And this is the view of Mount Ararat.
About how far out are we talking in terms of like before, BC?
So we're talking about beginning of Bronze Age, early Bronze Age early Middle Bronze Age. So about 3000 BC would be about 5,000 years back, because everything there indicates that people have had some sort of instruments to be able to work wood with quite successfully. And again, if we look, this is the region right here. So Great Armenia used to, of course, back in the day, and this is just going back in time. These are different stages of Armenia as it used to be. So if we look at this is the Byzantine Armenia right here. This is the Little Armenia area. This was the Great Armenia, and of course today it's a lot of it. And Soviet Armenia is here. So Armenia's borders have changed quite a bit. So when we're talking about the Armenian Plateau and we're talking about Armenian, this is obviously not Armenian, right? These images right here have nothing to do with the local region. I just found some of the images that may not be that far off in construction. Of course, they were not using the siding, but what I'm saying is the concept is not that different in the sense that you basically have a house that somebody adapted and adjusted for a situation. If you had, especially if they lived in a volcanically active region, and if they did know that occasionally, quite periodically, these dams broke and there was major flooding that could lift up from the bottom as well as come up from above. That person who had survived was his skill, because it is mentioned in all the sources that he was a very skilled total blank. Woodworker. What? Carpenter, that's the word. That he was a very skilled carpenter. And so that particular event may have left quite an impression. And the people who later became the Hurrian people, who later migrated down the mountains, who later influenced very deeply the culture down below in the valley and brought with them some of the echoes of their real actual anthropological and historical events that took place before that later got incorporated into what later, and I'm saying a lot of perhaps maybe in later, that later became what we know today as the Bible, as the Quran, and other various texts that have to do with this particular very interesting flood story. But that's pretty much I came across this theory and I kind of wanted to share it with you guys because I thought that'd be interesting. It's definitely different from the ones that we see on BBC and back when National Geographic and History Channel actually showed history.
Indeed, and quite good.
It's since we're talking about Caucasus, people in Caucasus, 100%, and that's again, Armenian people, Dagestani people, Chechen people, they are 100% convinced that Noah is a local figure. The name is so, the name is so incorporated into their language. There's, at one point in time, there were 5 different settlements that were considered to be that local people believed they were named Nakhchivali or Nakhchi this or that, because that was actually the place where Noah settled after the flood. So it's definitely...
It is kind of like the tale of the Christos, the Christ. We don't want to get into that one.
No, we're definitely not going to get into the Christ thing. The last interesting thing I was going to say is in some even later Syrian medieval Christian manuscripts mention that people did once upon a time. So medieval manuscripts mention references to much older legends that people at one time did know where the construction landed and that people would go up to it and that they would scrape off some of that pitch and use it as an ointment, use it as a medicinal substance, because it was believed to be holy. Now, of course, how long ago that was, whether or not that was actually true, we don't know. And as Chris said, besides the fact that wood is very likely to rot and just go away, no matter how good the preservation, I mean, especially something, I mean, again, we don't know how large this thing was. For all we know, it was just a single large extended family dwelling with their respective domestic animals and such. But people tend to take any nice construction that is made out of nicely cut pieces of wood or stone or bricks and rapidly take it apart. For example, it's happened to big parts of Colosseum, and build other lovely buildings out of them. So for all we know, some of the mosques, some of the old defensive towers in Caucasus, some of the old Armenian churches may have somewhere in them little chunks here and there. You know, if we want to be very hopeful and imaginative of this very great relic of so many world cultures. But yeah, I just wanted to present this theory because I have heard many theories on the flood. I have not heard a lot of theories on it. I mean, it's kind of generally known that Ararat is located in Caucasus, but the idea that actually the events may have taken place in Caucasus is not the idea that I have heard very often, at least broadcast in the Western scientific discourse.
Yeah, this is quite interesting because my own personal feeling is that a lot of the flood myths from the cultures around the world have flood myths, but there are lands that have disappeared when the ice age ended and the waters rose. Like Doggerland is gone, land to the west of India has gone, the Mediterranean has changed, and I had Atlantis is another example of an old story. So a lot of these lands have disappeared, but this story comes in the mountains which wouldn't have been affected by the sea level rises.
Right, and that, you know, and that's a good, again, I'm not here to present this as the only possible story out there, but I'm here to just bring it as another one of the many possible stories. And it's possible that there were, of course, many floods that happen over time in many different lands for various different reasons. I mean, I don't know how much domestication was happening in different regions. I mean, I do know in different regions it was very different how much domestication was actually taking place in various. Right, but for example, like the British Islands, I mean, again, it just depends locally, people, what kind of animals were being domesticated, whether it was large or small cattle, because I assume that if you had very large, well, yeah, but I doubt you would take an orc, for example, on an ark, let alone an elephant is the one picture, because I mean, I'm sorry, if I'm a person, even today, I think I would not like to transport elephants. Yeah. Oh, guys, I have heard an interesting bit completely off subject. Thank you for reminding me, David. So I have heard a very interesting and kind of a total up of the various archaeological news from a year 2021. I heard an interesting theory. So you know how when we talked about Sumeria, they talked about the idea that they were domesticating the wild donkeys and using them as their pulling animals for their carts and so forth in Sumeria. And people were very confused. What are these guys called? Totally, what are they called? Onagers, yeah. And today people try to domesticate onagers and have been awfully terribly unsuccessful. Well, I guess some records, and I need to double check this information, but there has been some indication come across that there was an actual breeding center somewhere in the region that intentionally developed a hybrid animal between a donkey and an onager, or at least some sort of other similar equine animal that was much more domesticatable, that they would cross. But because these hybrids, just like mules, were not fertile, it was a one-time animal. And so this particular practice, the art of doing so, was kept in the greatest of secrets. And these animals were exceptionally outrageously expensive, and that they had a whole, almost of, industrial scale production of these very specialized, back then, miraculous and rare animals, because this was before the horse was introduced to the region, and that was or even domesticated. And so it was very much, that was the precious know-how. And had humans eaten all the horses, as they tend to do before they had a chance to domesticate them, it's possible that today we would not be breeding horses, but we would still be improving the lines of these two other animals more related to the donkeys, and every time having to create hybrids that are both more domesticatable and stronger than the original stock. I thought that was pretty fascinating information.
For the wagons.
Yeah, but it would be interesting to watch, for example, the first years of the first even hundreds of years of America, for example, if the whole wagons, go west to campaign would have been done with these kind of very rare, imported from somewhere in Mesopotamia, onager donkey crosses. Definitely would be much more expensive enterprise than it turned out to be. Yeah.
Yeah, if you can make a hybrid, I'm just thinking of weaponization of an animal. So if you can export a hybrid and you have control of its breeding,
Right.
then it cannot be weaponized against you.
Right, and so that's why it was. I'm sure it was even seen as a sacred technology, because it was wondrous, right? Nobody else could produce these very useful, basically tools. I mean, these animals were machines; they were tools for war, for transportation, for and I mean, they must have been extremely elite and extremely precious and extremely well protected, secret. So yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to share today, and we're not even going over time. If anybody else has any thoughts.
Yeah. Speaking of that, in regards to Noah's Ark, I want to know what happened to the unicorns.
About that.
But what Chris was saying earlier, with regards to the history around the world previously of, if you will, global flooding, the recession of the glaciation, the recession of the Ice Age, and all that land where so many people lived on these continental shelves, which is now under about 200 to 400 feet of water.
Right.
And that's a history we have no access to currently. But there's a if you will, there's a psychological and story history, and very much what you're speaking of. I guess what you're offering to this group tonight is a very poignant, localized, condensed version of something that perhaps was very familiar and still within the living memory of cultures around the world, because so many cultures have a flood story.
Right, and so it's an overlap forming the whole final narrative, is what Chris was saying earlier. Absolutely, yeah.
Right, and so having a very localized, poignant flood episode, perhaps very much was within people's their conceptual like ability, their ability to conceptualize, like, yeah, we know this there's a history of this, and this happened, boom, here now, and it just massively reinforced.
Right.
I think one of the issues we have is with timing, because when you think about when writing started, so a lot of these stories that if we try to date them, they end up being dated to around when they were written down. But of course, they could be thousands of years old by then and handed down orally. Like, I personally think the flood myths happened about 10,000 years ago and were written down perhaps 5,000 years ago.
And that makes a lot of sense. And as I like to say, reality is complex, multi-layered, and fluid. It's so, I mean, all of these things can absolutely 100% simultaneously be true to where you.
May I ask a question?
Go right ahead.
Yahtzee, as you call yourself. Now, you come from the Navajo, yes?
Yes.
What are your oral traditions?
Okay, we are in the fourth world, and we left the third world. The third world got flooded, and I guess what you would call an ark for us would be like a hollow reed that the people move through from the third world into the fourth world, which is the present world.
I have a question. I know my Mesoamerican knowledge at best is I know that, of course, your peoples are not. I'm not saying that, but I know that there's similar mythology. What were the previous two events? I'm just wondering how the mythology that you're speaking of correlates to the Mesoamerican concept that there was, originally the people who turned out not to be very functional.
I
Oh, their
can,
oral histories are actually amazingly good. Like my ex was a historian for her people, the Gwich'in people, which are actually related to the Navajo. They're both Athabascan peoples, and she has stories about people arriving here around about the end of the Ice Age, and that there were people here already, which they call the ancestors. So we're talking 10,000 years ago. So their oral histories go back at least 10,000 years, and I'm sure the Navajo is very similar.
Go ahead. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, well,
We're all staring at you.
I just know about the flood story, and yeah, that I know like the Hopis are older than us. They were already here, and us Athabascans, we came down from the north, from Canada, into the Southwest.
Right.
So Navajos and Apaches, we're part of the same linguistic group.
And the same as the Gwich'ins and the Trondek Gwich'in and people up here in the Yukon and Northwest Territories and Alaska. It's the same sort of people. And it seems to be a second wave of migration from Siberia and that area, Chukchi. And
Yeah, well, the guys, when we get to discussing the New World, y'all are going to be the ones doing the lecturing, because that's a subject that I'm very respectful of, and do not ever want to misintroduce, especially considering I'm not a part of that culture now.
my
Dave
apologies.
wants to jump in real quick.
Just a little geologic. At the height of the ice ages, they say that up to 30% of the world's water was in ice, compared to about 10% now. So think how much water that is.
So to put what David is saying in context, so shortly outside of here in Laramie is Medicine Bow Peak, and it's just over 10,000 feet tall. And so to put that in perception, some of the glaciers were over 10,000 feet thick. And so imagine a glacier at Medicine Bow Peak here in Laramie, that basically the edge of it would be just putting into, I'm creating a visual comparable. The edge of it is New Orleans.
Yeah, could you poke your head out for a second? Sorry, but we have the cleaning people as usual coming through with very loud and happy noise. But that's pretty much everything I had to say. I haven't decided on which of the Caucasian peoples, because there's still, I mean, obviously we're not going to be able to go over every single Caucasian group, but some of them did not form until much later. So the Hurrians and the Urartu people are the people we best know of that are very early. There's other groups of people, some, the Adiga Abkhazian linguistic group, for example, and what is nowadays is known as Nakhchi, or Nakhchi, a linguistic group that includes Ingush people, Chechen people, and some other people. There are Cherkess people. There's a lot of different language groups and cultures. There's some other groups that have their roots really deep in history, and they may have not formed, as far as we know, that far back in time, such enormous and well-organized cultures that we know of today, but they have had an enormous and interesting history. And so I kind of would want to at least surface touch on those groups, because in the West, hardly anybody ever talks about them. And I think they very much deserve to be known and recognized. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And guys, I just want to say, I'm sure some of you know, I've been dealing with a lot of medical issues lately, and just everybody's ongoing support in this group is so helpful to me. And I apologize if I've been maybe not quite as on the spot as I usually am. It's been an interesting couple of months, but I don't want to give up doing this. It's kind of yeah, but it's a very important and interesting project for me, and having you guys' support is enormously.
It doesn't show. It doesn't show. So that's you're fine. As far as we're concerned, you're fine.
Thank you so much, guys. But yeah, I appreciate each and every one of you and everything you can do.
Shows.
Thank you, everyone. You take care, guys.
archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.